Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Warren Klein, and I'm curator of our Bernard Museum here at Temple Emanu-El. And welcome to the last event of the Winter-Spring 2022 semester. This semester, we have hosted over 42 events, with 20 of them taking place at Temple Emanu-El. We had 6,000 people join us in person and over 42,000 join us virtually. In recognition of Jewish American Heritage Month, we at the Temple Emanu-El Streicker Center are hosting this critical and timely discussion on antisemitism. The excuses have morphed over the last 5 centuries. Egyptians taught that Jews were innately evil. Spaniards attacked us for spreading the Black Plague. Russians accused us of draining the blood of Christian children for matzo. Germans insisted we promoted communism. Socialists branded us bloodsucking capitalists, while white nationalists warned that we were plotting to take over the world. Now, David Duke preaches that we brainwashed Americans into electing Barack Obama. Louis Farrakhan calls us Satan, and in recent polls, 35% of Europeans claim that supporters of Israel use accusations of antisemitism to shut down criticism of Israel. With increased anti-Semitic attacks, speech, and postings rising across the globe, has anything changed, or are we stuck in the familiar pattern of everything old is new again? Our panelists today include Simone Rodin-Benzaken, Managing Director of the American Jewish Committee for Europe, overseeing offices in Berlin, Brussels, Paris, Prague, Rome, Sofia, and Central Europe. Abe Foxman, National Director Emeritus of the Anti-Defamation League and member of President Biden's United States Holocaust Memorial Council. Jonathan Weissman, senior political writer for the New York Times and author of Semitism, Being Jewish in America in the Age of Trump. We are moderated by journalist and author Abigail Program, and please join me today in welcoming our panelists.
Thank you, Warren, and thank you to our panelists. I'm unmuted, yes. Wave your hand if you can hear me, panelists. Good to be with you. Obviously, this is a tough subject, and it's one that I think if you are a Jew who cares, you've been thinking a lot about. I'm hoping today that we shed as much light as maybe raising the temperature. We've had a lot of heat because the things that we're struggling with in many ways feel intractable, and I'm hoping that we can get to a place at least of more understanding and maybe even a blueprint for how to respond to where we are right now. I want to start with our, I don't want to say eminence grise. I don't know if you appreciate eminence grise, Abe, but it's great to be with you, Abe Foxman. Obviously, you have not just worked in this area, but lived this from the very beginning, from your childhood. So it's a very personal story for you. I was, in preparing for this, I was listening to an interview you gave where you said, when I graduated law school, I thought I would look at anti-Semitism as a lesson of history, not as a current event. How can you put that quote into context today where it feels more current than ever?
I was wrong. I was so wrong.
And you so rarely are, Abe.
No, I think we understood history, but I guess I missed understanding what we say every Passover at the Seder. We say, "B'chol dor v'dor omdim aleinu l'chalotenu." In every generation, they stand against us to destroy us, and I guess we didn't pay attention to it, and we try to ignore it. But also in the United States, Abigail, we lived in a bubble. The United States is not immune from anti-Semitism, but it is different. It's unique. And for 100 years, we developed a containment strategy, a firewall, which protected us. And so it was easy to believe that it's part of the past.
Can you just tell us what that firewall was as you see it?
We built a consensus of civility, that there were consequences. The American Constitution permits you to be a bigot, an anti-Semite, a racist, But America developed consequences. You paid a social price because there was a consensus of civility in this country. We built coalitions. We used truth as the answer to the big lie. We used media to educate, to expose, to shame. All these things worked for us. But in the last several years, they dissipated. The firewall dissipated. All taboos were broken, and of course, with it, the ability to be more racist, and therefore, the mother of all hates, be more anti-Semitic.
And we're going to get to the whys, but I first want to just talk about the state of play right now. And I want to go to you, Simone. Again, preparing for this, I heard an interview in which you described growing up in Germany, hearing never again over and over again. And it felt in a way like an unshakable truth that some that we in a way graduated from this history. Can you give us your sense of the lay of the land, and particularly through the lens of Europe, which I know is your expertise?
Sure. So just like Abe, I grew up with the idea, despite having grown up in Europe, the continent of anti-Semitism, that never again actually meant something, and that history wouldn't repeat itself, and that somehow, we had learned from the past. And I had to learn pretty early on that was not the case, that anti-Semitism is a phenomenon, a worldview, a conspiracy theory that tends to come back whenever there are problems within our society. And in all of our societies, I think there are. So in Europe, it's at least a 2-decade-old problem, and in particular in France, where I moved to a little bit over 20 years ago, which to some extent is really sort of the ground zero of this contemporary form of anti-Semitism. We had this problem for very seriously for 2 decades. When you compare the numbers of anti-Semitic hate crimes in the late 90s, you would have 83, 84 anti-Semitic acts a year. You go to the year of 2001, which was really sort of the beginning of it all, the beginning of the Second Intifada, 9/11, et cetera. We can go into later why. We jumped up to 350 anti-Semitic acts, and since then have never been able to go below that number. So now we go between 350 to nearly 1,000 anti-Semitic acts a year, which represents 1 to 3 anti-Semitic acts a day. Out of all of the recorded hate crimes, 40 to 50% of all violent acts are of anti-Semitic nature for a Jewish population that represents less than 1% of the total. And since 2003, which was the first anti-Semitic murder in France, we've had 13 French Jews who were killed simply because they were Jewish, from children as young as 3 years old in Toulouse to a handicapped Holocaust survivor as old as 85. So now we have seen the problem spread. We have seen the problem spread across Europe, in Germany, the United Kingdom, Belgium, Denmark, Sweden, to just name a few. Obviously also Central Europe, where it is slightly different.
Just to interrupt for a minute, when you hear it, as I'm sure you do, that some say that Jews, and I find this anti-Semitic, but I want to give air to all of what we hear, are that Jews are hyper alarmed, that they are, overly sensitive to a climate, and that and ringing alarm bells when actually their lives are fairly safe. Can you push back on that very concretely with why those who are worried, particularly in Europe, have good reason?
Sure. First of all, as I just mentioned, 13 Jews in France alone were killed simply because they were Jewish. When you ask French Jews about their experience, AJC did several polls in France and in Germany. It's very, very clear. 74% of French Jews between 18 and 24 have already experienced anti-Semitism. 60% of all acts are happening in schools, including violent acts. So that's the situation. Parents are afraid. Parents are afraid to send their kids to public schools. You have areas outside of Paris, which we call the banlieue, which are sort of the suburbs, but not nice American suburbs, but a little bit more complicated suburbs, suburban areas where you nearly have no Jewish school children in public schools, simply because it's become impossible, because parents are afraid, because kids are getting attacked. And that's the reality of anti-Semitism today. So I wouldn't say we're hypersensitive. I wish our reality was very, very different. I wish we didn't have to care about anti-Semitism. And I don't think anyone else would accuse any other minority of being hypersensitive when there is racism.
Thank you. Jonathan, I want to particularly ask you about social media in terms of painting the landscape as it is, because that's something you not only researched as a reporter, but experienced personally. And for those who aren't familiar with your book, if you could just give a condensed sense of just how you even came to write about this issue very personally, and what we might be missing when it comes to the conversation, if you can call it conversation, because to use Abe's word civility, it seems to have died on Twitter.
Mm-hmm. Okay, shameless plug, yes, Semitism. I wrote this book because during the 2016 campaign, I was an editor. I'm now back to writing, but I was an editor at the New York Times. And I was absolutely deluged by anti-Semitic hate on Twitter. And we're not talking about just comments. We're talking about brutal photos, people, images like my face superimposed on Holocaust survivors, superimposed on pictures of a Nazi about to shoot my head off, taken from World War II, and just an absolute barrage coming from supporters of then candidate Donald Trump. I mean, they were done. That barrage came as under the guise of Trumpism. And, as it turned out, this was an organized campaign by neo-Nazis who had actually found a way to target Jews, Jewish journalists, by creating a software plugin that could detect these three parentheses that they would put around targeted Jews. And with the right software, you could then plug it into Google, find out who was being targeted by a neo-Nazi website called the Daily Stormer, and go after the chosen target of that moment. Now, Twitter and these attacks would morph into other social media, eventually into phone calls, voicemails, and we were. I was genuinely worried that it would come into reality. And I remember I finished the first draft of this book. It was actually about to be, it was in edits. And I went on a vacation, exhausted, and then Charlottesville happened in 2017, and I had predicted in the book that this action that was happening online would eventually morph into in the flesh hatred. And then when we saw the tiki torches and the chants of Jews will not replace us, I realized it did. I pulled the book back. I had to reflect that had happened. And it has only become worse, that social media is where the ideas germinate and where organizations are formed. But now there's no denying that the bigotry that fulminates online is now bursting into reality. Yeah. And of course, we saw mass shootings in Pittsburgh and to El Paso, and just now in Buffalo, as a manifestation of that.
Yeah. And just to pick up on Charlottesville, Abe, I want to go to you on Jews will not replace us, because many of us, when we first heard that, we have now learned since, we understand it a little more in its layers and complexity. Not that I want to give it credence of being a dignified, complex idea, but the idea of replacement theory, the idea that Jews are actually, it's not just that Jews are taking the place of people, but they are bringing in groups that we're talking about white supremacists particularly are allergic to or are demonizing? Give us a sense of, is that a new iteration, at least particularly in America, that you've seen, the replacement theory? And before you answer, I just want to remind people that the Buffalo killer recently, 2 weeks ago, in his manifesto, which was 180 pages, focused a great deal, obviously, primarily on African Americans, on Black people. Also talked, spent some pages on Jews, and one of the quotes was, "I wish all Jews to go to hell," but the replacement theory was all through that manifesto. So Abe, take the floor, and we didn't hear you as well last time, so please speak up a bit.
Okay, so I guess to the larger issue, there's nothing new in anti-Semitism. It's basically the old themes, same content, which is Jews want power. Either they want power to make money or they want money to have power. They want control. They want control of media. They want control of the banks. They want control of political institutions. And one way, of course, to get the control is by population control. So it's another dimension of this stereotype that Jews can't be trusted because they only care about themselves. And what do they want for themselves? They want power and influence and money. And so this is just another dimension. How do they get it? They replace the population which they cannot control, the whites, the white supremacists, the majority, by a population, minorities, brown, Black, which they can control. And one of the ways to obtain this control is to open up the gates, bring them in. So if you remember in Pittsburgh, what was our sin? Our sin was highest Hebrew immigrants because they had a weekend dedicated to refugees. So therefore, ironically, Jews were excluded from America. The quotas against Jews in this country were horrific. And yet here it is, this canard being used now that Jews control the immigration policy, and therefore this is another way that we take over the country and control it.
Yeah, Simone mentioned this. I was going to say this too. I do not ever want to separate anti-Semitism from broader bigotry, because I don't want to suggest that somehow Jews are the only ones who are subject to bigotry. But there is a difference in anti-Semitism and other forms of bigotry, and it is that it is always tied to a conspiracy theory. Anti-Semitism is fundamentally a conspiracy theory. And when I was writing, it was not called the Great Replacement Theory. It was actually called white genocide, but it was the exact same thing. The idea is that white supremacists see people of Black skin or brown skin, and they believe that they're inferior beings, but it doesn't fit the conspiracy, because how could these inferior beings be replacing them, taking over society when they're inferior? So they create this idea that the Jews are the puppet masters, and that Jews, in fact, there's this notion that the Ashkenazi Jew is of the most superior intellect of all humans, but that by nature, Ashkenazi Jews use their genius for nefarious purposes. And that conspiracy is that Jews are leading the tide of brown and Black-skinned people to replace white people. And in that conspiracy, Jews are not white. And that's actually an important, bizarre component of this whole thing.
Yeah, and that's where.
Sorry.
Go ahead, Simone. Go.
Yeah, no, sorry if I may. Actually, it's interesting because the way ideas travel, of course, through social media, but they have always traveled. But actually, the replacement theory is originally a French theory by a French author who pretends to come from the left, called Renaud Camus. And so indeed, it's indeed very old anti-Semitic conspiracy theory that consists in placing the Jew as the absolute manipulator. That's how the difference is, I think, between anti-Semitism and racism. Racism is often sees the other minority as an inferior race. Anti-Semitism has this thing of seeing the Jew, and in particular the invisible Jew, because the Jew is not as visible, of course, as any other minority, as somehow this conspiratorial group, this being that is trying to manipulate the world, whether it's a Zionist conspiracy or indeed with a replacement theory. What I also find interesting with the idea of anti-Semitism is that Jews have always been accused of being one thing and the exact opposite. It used to be Jews used to be capitalists, and then they used to be communists. Now the far right blames the Jews for threatening the established order or for trying to replace the established, or the extreme left blames it for belonging to it and for serving it. So, the Jew to some extent is sort of this, this idea that sort of this contaminator that threatens the purity of a vision and of an ideology. And that's why I think we are exactly in the situation we are in today, is because we are in a general state of confusion in our societies, partly due to social media, but for many other reasons, because I think our liberal democracies at the end of the day are in huge crisis.
And Abe, I want to just get to Holocaust history, because first of all, you have firsthand experience with it. But I wanted to really get at whether this is, that were it for more, less ignorance, we wouldn't be here. That if there was some sense, and it's not that Holocaust history animates compassion and the lack of anti-Semitism, but it certainly reframes for many people who have oversimplified the Jewish story or have actually denied the Jewish story what this history means. Can you give us a sense from your perspective at the numbers? I don't have them at my fingertips, maybe you know them, but very few states, I think, require it. There is certainly not a majority of schools teaching it. Is it making a difference in this landscape?
We have to hope that it makes a difference, because as long as we don't have a vaccine or an antidote, the only answer we have to fight anti-Semitism is education, education, education. You can be infected much quicker than you can be educated against it. So we have no other vehicle. We talk about it. We used to have the truth. We no longer have the truth to the big lie. So it's still education. Education is a long process. Part of the education process is teaching history, and history, teaches us what we hope we don't repeat. I always saw the teaching of Holocaust history as a lesson to see what hate can do. This Auschwitz, not because of the Jews, not because we were singled out, because again, history singled us out, but see how far words can go. And, the bricks in Auschwitz did not begin with bricks. They began with words, hateful words that were met with silence. Nobody stood up. Nobody said no. Nobody challenged them. Nobody questioned. That's the universal lesson. Now, we've always had this sensitivity. If we universalize the Holocaust, that we cheapen it, we soften it. And so we've been always uncomfortable with universalizing it. No, the Holocaust is unique, but the lessons of the Holocaust are not unique. They are universal. Never again was a Jewish experience, but never again should teachers never again to be silent when anybody is singled out because of their race, their color, their sexual orientation, because of the other. So yes, it could be a very, very significant vehicle. Look, the experience in Washington, the U.S. Holocaust Museum, 43 million have visited since its opening, and they're mostly students, kids, 90%, 95% non-Jewish. I am optimist. I believe they walk away with an understanding, not about Jews, but about hate. And that's, we don't have a better, sadly, historical experience to convey.
Thank you. Jonathan, Whoopi Goldberg recently got into some trouble when she said the Holocaust is not about race, it's about man's humanity, inhumanity to man. You saw the response to that. She apologized for it. She's not the first person to make those kinds of missteps. And I just wonder, do you feel like there is a overreaction to those kinds of missteps or an overdue accountability?
No, I think in certainly in that case, there is an overreaction, because I think that this issue about race, about whether Jews are a race, is actually a very difficult one for Jews and for non-Jews. And it tends to be anti-Semites who see Jews as some kind of separate race. So I think that everybody needs to be a little understanding, especially of non-Jews and their confusion about exactly how to classify Jews, us. I mean, are we a religion? Are we a people? Are we a nation? Are we a race? It is hard. It is complicated. And I think that everybody has to recognize ill will and goodwill and understand when a comment is driven by confusion or malice. And I think that sometimes confusion is what is the pertinent thing. And I feel like Whoopi Goldberg apologized, and I think other people have have made similar missteps and apologized, and we certainly should be respectful and accepting of those apologies and understand how confusing this question can be.
But I think that part of what
I disagree.
Go ahead.
Amy and I are going to disagree about a lot of things together.
I hope so. And I want to encourage people to put your questions in the chat. We're going to get to them, and we haven't even touched on Israel yet, and we have a half an hour left. So, Abe, I want to hear your pushback.
First of all, I don't think we always have the option of being so rational and reasonable. She is a celebrity. She has a platform. And when she says something bigoted or outrageous, I don't think we have the option to be quiet and silent and just ignore it. And this is another one of those situations. By the way, several years ago, when I criticized her, she had a recipe that she sent, a Jewish American princess recipe full of anti-Semitic stereotypes. And when I said that borders on anti-Semitism, she called, cursed me out, etc. So the thing is, it's not just ignorance, it's based on prejudice. And sometimes we don't have the option of being so nice and polite. She apologized, and then she said that's because she wanted it to go away. She didn't want to be canceled. Okay.
And silence is never something that I never caution. I never prescribe silence. Silence is, Jews aren't silent. We should never be silent. It's a question of what we say.
Okay, Simone, did you want to respond?
Yeah, if I may, on both issues. From a European perspective, it's actually interesting. What I found particularly disturbing with the Whoopi Goldberg comment is to try and impose a contemporary world vision of categorization of races onto the past. And I think, I spoke earlier on about why I think anti-Semitism is there, and in particular also on the left. And I think it has part to do with this purist vision, meaning that if you are looking at the world in sort of a categorization of races, the blacks are victims, whites are oppressors. Where do the Jews fit in? It's obviously complicated in this very, very categorized world where Jews actually are everything. It's a fluid identity. They are black, they are white, they are brown, they are Middle Eastern, they are Ashkenazi, they are Sephardi, they're a race, they're a religion, they're everything. And so it's not surprising, I think, that within that this very, bizarre way of trying to categorize people, that Jews obviously fall into a category, in either category, which becomes complicated. The other about the Holocaust, about Holocaust education, in Europe, Holocaust education is compulsory 3 times in our school systems. And still, it hasn't prevented anti-Semitism. So I fear, unfortunately, that doesn't mean I don't think Holocaust education is important. I think it's absolutely crucial, first of all, because I think, placing understanding what happened and understanding history is absolutely crucial in trying to understand the present. But I don't think it's a vaccine, unfortunately, for contemporary anti-Semitism today. And that is even more true because I think that the way we have tried to teach the Holocaust is not at all. And I think there is a link to what Abe said earlier on. We have tried to teach the Holocaust either by learning the numbers, the years, the events, the facts, or by trying to appeal to people, to youngsters, to kids' emotions. And I think what we haven't tried to do is try and, rather than going through the eyes of the victim, meaning the Jews, try to understand how the Holocaust could happen. What happened in German society? What made it possible? Where does anti-Semitism come from? Where does hate come from? What were the different social psychological processes that allowed for the Holocaust to operate? And then try and draw comparisons to today. And I think far too often we're not trying to appeal to children's intelligence and reflection. We're trying to appeal to people's emotions. And I think that's where a lot of things, unfortunately, can go wrong.
And you just raised this idea of Jews as the white oppressor. Abe, I want to talk to you about the racialization, as Amati Friedman puts it, putting in American terms or language, essentially the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and seeing Jews as the colonizers, as promulgating apartheid. This language that is now conflated in many ways with the American Jew is obviously changing the landscape of anti-Semitism, and particularly on college campuses. Can you address what that again, not a sea change, but certainly heightened?
We forget it started 25, 30 years ago in the Durban Conference in South Africa. Conference was called to deal with global racism, and it wound up dealing with Zionism as racism. Then it was followed by the United Nations passing a resolution that Zionism is racism. So it's not new. It's been out there. What's new today is what Jonathan raises, and that's the whole social media world, the internet world, which gives us a platform which we never could have imagined. And so it's taken on a life of its own. Ironically, Abigail, the Zionist movement believed, that one way to stop anti-Semitism is the creation of the Jews as a normal people with a state, with a flag, with a nationality, etc. And ironically, what's happened in recent 20, 30 years is it's become a platform, an excuse, a euphemism, a rationalization for anti-Semitism. And so to the extent that there were certain things that, everybody could do, but Jews couldn't do. Today, it's every nation could do certain things, but when it comes to Israel, it can't. Every nation in the world decides what its capital is, not Israel. Every country in the world, when attacked, responds to defend its citizens. When Israel responds to defend its citizens, it becomes subject of UN discussions, debates, etc. So ironically, the establishment of the State of Israel has provided a platform for anti-Semites to say, I love Jews, I just don't like Zionists, I don't like Israelis. That plays on campus disproportionately, totally disproportionately, and it's impacting on our kids.
And I heard you say in another interview that if a student has certain values and is uncomfortable with the status quo in Israel, you want to hear that they apply those values equally to China or Venezuela or Syria or Russia. Give us a little sense of just the uniqueness of the focus.
There are two elements. One is criticism of Israel. There's more criticism of Israel per square Jew, per square kilometer in Israel than any country in the world. So it's not a question you can't criticize. Jews criticize Israel, others, it's not a question. You can criticize. As long as you set a certain value, you set a certain standard, a certain morality, that's fine. Apply it elsewhere. If the only country that you apply it to is the Jewish state, then it's anti-Semitism. And going back to anti-Zionism, there are people who are opposed to nationalities. There are universalists in this world, globalists. God bless them. So if they're opposed to nationality, fine. But if the only nationality that they're opposed to is the Zionist movement, which is the national aspiration of the Jewish people to be a people, but Palestinian nationalism is fine, French nationalism is fine. We know you're not a universalist person who's opposed to isms. You're just another anti-Semite.
Okay, and before I go to Jonathan and Simone on the same question, your successor, Jonathan Greenblatt, just a couple weeks ago, asserted that anti-Zionism is unequivocally anti-Semitism. And can I put you on the spot and say whether you agree?
With all due respect to my successor, hello, the organized Jewish community, after Durban, after Zionism, racism, we come to the conclusion that anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism a long time ago. So welcome, Jonathan. I'm glad you're there, and I'm glad you're speaking in that language.
Okay. Jonathan, can you first respond to the Jonathan Greenblatt equation?
I will unequivocally say that I like Jonathan Greenblatt a lot, and I think he is unequivocally wrong, and I think that Abe is unequivocally wrong here. And I think that we should never conflate political speech, no matter how repugnant we think it is, to speech about bigotry. And look, Jews fought against the notion of Zionism as bigotry, and now we are the ones promulgating the idea of anti-Zionism as bigotry. And I know that I'm going to be the least popular person on this conversation, and I'm sure with my listeners as well. But I will just ask them to think of this. Sorry if my dog's making noise. If a Tibetan said, I hate the Han Chinese and I really wish they left my land. Or if a Native American said, these Europeans, they came, they colonized, they took over my land and I want them to leave. We might hate that if the Chinese get incensed about Tibetans, but we still think that is a political statement that a Tibetan is allowed to make or a Native American is allowed to make. And yet somehow if a Palestinian says the equivalent, it's anti-Semitic. And I just fundamentally disagree. I have Palestinian friends. A dear friend of mine is a Palestinian activist. And I always say to Yusuf, it must be so painful because you look at what is happening, you see injustice in your land with your family, and you can't even talk about it. Because if you talk about the injustice that is befalling your family, you're called an anti-Semite. I'm sorry, I feel really strongly about this, and I know that other people will disagree, but I will just say it.
But we're not talking about people who advocate for Palestinian statehood, independence, freedom. We're talking about people who don't want the Jewish state to exist. That's what BDS is all about. Anti-Zionism is not pro-Palestinianism. I have no problem with promoting Palestinian rights, Palestinian equality, Palestinian statehood, 2 states. I have no problem whatsoever. I will stand with them. I will embrace them. My problem is these people are not about pro-Palestinian. They don't want the Jewish state to exist. And that to me, sorry.
That too is a political comment. If you don't want the that might be really offensive, but it is still a political position.
Okay.
Sorry, I think the problem is often that we are not 100% in agreement of what we're actually talking about. I think when we use the word Zionism or anti-Zionism, you might use it in one way, Abe might use it in a different way, and you know what? An anti-Semite might actually use it in a different way. And I think that's part of the problem. And usually when I have these kind of conversations, when people say, well, I'm not an anti-Semite, I'm an anti-Zionist. My first question I always ask is, what do you mean by that? If it means, well, I'm critical of Israel's settlement policy, okay, I wouldn't necessarily call that an anti-Zionist, but why not? Fair enough. If Mohammed Hadid, as he did last week, says Zionism is controlling the media, do we really believe that is anti-Zionism and not anti-Semitism? When you have people in the streets of Paris shouting, death to Israel, death to Jews, do we really think this is anti-Zionism just a usual normal expression of, a political opinion? I'm not entirely sure. So I think part of the problem is that we're not always talking about the same thing. I think Emmanuel Macron, the French president, and before him, the French Prime Minister, Manuel Valls and Angela Merkel and others have said it pretty well. They don't equate anti-Zionism with anti-Semitism, but what they usually say is that anti-Semites, for a large part, hide behind a so-called anti-Zionism. And I think that is probably more accurate.
And Simone, I absolutely agree with everything you just said, because as I said, anti-Semitism at its heart is a conspiracy theory. And if you use anti-Zionism as a conspiracy, as the anti-Zionists Zionists are controlling the media, or if you use if there's collective punishment, if every Jew is responsible for the actions of the government in Jerusalem, that is anti-Semitism. There's no question.
I would just say,
making a political statement about the role of Israel is not anti-Semitism.
And what about saying that Israel is not a legitimate state?
That is a political statement.
Oh, and that's
you might find it utterly repugnant. You might absolutely hate it, but that is a political position. That is not a peace position.
I think the moderator is getting silenced, so I'm taking back the floor. I just want to, I hear what you're all saying. I think Simone has maybe said it most accurately. There is, in some ways, we're getting bogged down, I think, even though these definitions matter, in the wording and not so much in the content of where are we in terms of when is anti-Zionism, anti-Semitism, and not that it always is, because I think that this is part of where the conversation is stopping instead of people focusing on the actual issue. But I'm glad that you all feel strongly about it. I want to go to questions because there are a lot and I have more of my own. Some attendees are asking, how is it possible that we have elected officials being reelected after making outright anti-Semitic comments? Obviously, all three of you can't answer all of these, but if someone wants to respond, jump into that.
Well, I'll jump in because I cover Congress. The fact is that you have Marjorie Taylor Greene will be reelected in a landslide. She just easily won the Republican primary. And if you went to go talk to the constituents in Northwest Georgia, they would not say, I'm voting for Marjorie Taylor Greene because she's an anti-Semite. They just wouldn't care that she was an anti-Semite. These are not the issues that are front and center. And I would not read too much into the re-election of somebody like Paul Gosar or Marjorie Taylor Greene, even though I would say they are anti-Semitic.
This is for you, Abe. Karen is asking, it seems that we should assume that never again is a fantasy. Do you agree that our hope rests with Jewish education and with better informed Jews?
I wouldn't say it's a fantasy. I think it's an aspiration. I think it's a hope. You're talking to a survivor. I don't think any survivor will say that never again was accomplished or is an imperative or is a commandment. It's a hope and aspiration. How we get there, there is no one route. There is no one panacea. There is no one silver bullet. Part of it is memory. Part of it is teaching about it. Part of it is most of it is standing up to hate, to bigotry, to prejudice. That's what will make it happen never again. It won't happen because we're going to talk about victims or the Holocaust or hate. I think it needs to be our guiding light, but we need to understand that it's not a given. You have to work for it, and there is no one path. There are a lot of paths, and each one of us. But to me, the most important, and Abigail, I survived the Holocaust. I tried to figure out what I survived, and I decided to bear witness to not the evil, not the brutality, not the hatred, but to the good. I survived because there was a woman who risked her life every single day for 4 years to save me. And so to me, the message is that people can make a difference. They can make a difference which goes as far as saving lives And it starts by saying no to hate, no to anti-Semitism, no to bigotry. And if there were more Denmarks and more Bulgarias and more Albanias, we wouldn't have so many Holocaust museums. But the potential for people in Bulgaria and Albania and Denmark and France exists everywhere, including the United States. We have to find a way how to get the bystanders to be upstanders. That's a major challenge. And it's more difficult in today's political environment and the environment where, as I said, we've lost privacy, now we're losing civility. We have no consensus on civility. And then it's hard to say to your children, your grandchildren, your friends, you need to stand up for the truth when they say, what is the truth?
Simone Sharon's asking, I am a Canadian Jew who's been living in Paris for 35 years. In looking at the landscape in this country, I find that other minorities do a much better job at fighting anti-ness. Do we need to change our approach about how we show anti-Semitism to other people?
I think for me, the most important message that we have been trying to convey is that anti-Semitism is, as you say so interestingly in English, the canary in the coal mine. That anti-Semitism is ultimately the symptom of a far deeper problem, of the falling apart of our liberal democracies, and therefore concerns all of us collectively. The one encouraging issue point that we've seen over the last, it's relatively recent, over the last years, is that we've been polling French opinion for many years. And we really have seen an evolution amongst French people. Today, 73% of French people believe that anti-Semitism is not the problem of Jews alone, it's the problem of society as a whole. And I think that's the answer. If we get to 100%, and if we get to 100% who also feel that they have to do about something about it, then I think we have won the battle. This is the issue about universalism. I'm not gay. I'm not black. I'm no Muslim. I do care about the fact when Muslims are attacked. I do care about the fact when gays are attacked. I do care about that's at the end of the day what I think our societies should be about, and that's why our liberal democracies should be about. If we as liberal democracies cannot protect minorities anymore, why have them in the first place?
Barbara's asking, for anyone who wants to take this, how should one defend the settlements, taking over Palestinian land and preventing Palestinians from farming, etc.? How do we address this issue on college campuses where there is an influx of anti-Semitism that stems from the issue of settlements and, quote, stolen land?
Well, I would take...
Sorry, I'm going to let Abe talk and then I'll talk.
John, I'll let you answer. I would just take issue with the fact that the anti-Semitism stems from settlements. That's nonsense. There were no settlements and there was anti-Semitism. There was no settlements before 1967 and there was no peace in Israel. There's no negotiation, et cetera, et cetera. So, yeah, it is a problem, Jonathan. I defer to you how to handle it, but it's not the core of the reason of anti-Semitism on campus. It's an excuse.
What I was going to say is during my, when I was on a book tour, I was invariably often teamed with somebody from the Anti-Defamation League from wherever I happened to be going. And I was always surprised that I would be, that the book event would be kind of accosted by people who are there actually to yell at the Anti-Defamation League representative about Israel. And I used to say, look, we're here to talk about anti-Semitism and bigotry at large. And I would just, there are fundamental disagreements here about Israel, Palestine, and autonomy on this land. And can we just set it aside and talk instead about what we came to talk about, which is anti-Semitism and bigotry? But as the years went by, I realized that setting aside it wasn't going to work. It wasn't going to work. In fact, I went to the Anti-Defamation League and I said, I would be willing to come work for you if you were willing to begin a program to actually start from the very bottom rung and try to come up with a way to address grievances with Israel and over the Palestine issue, because you cannot just sweep it under the rug. It just will not work. I even wrote a chapter of my book called The Israel Deception about how Jews have spent so much of the last 20 years obsessing over the Israel question that they didn't see the rise of right-wing anti-Semitism and bigotry in their midst. And so when it came rushing upon us in 2000 with the election of Trump in 2016, I don't think we just kind of didn't see it coming because we weren't watching for it. I think we have to start addressing these questions.
Hello.
Go ahead, Abe. Sorry.
Jonathan, with all due respect, I was at the ADL 50 years. I was there 30 years. Most of the work that we did on anti-Semitism was directed at right-wing anti-Semitism, white racism. I would say 90% of it. So to say we ignored it, the audience.
Oh, no, I'm not. Wait a minute. No, I was not saying the Anti-Defamation League. That's what the ADL does. I'm saying the Jewish community. I don't
think the Jewish community should develop lessons as how to defend Israel from what it believes is its policy to survive. I don't think that's. I always believed it's our responsibility to defend Israel against lies, against defamation, against distortion. That still continues. But I don't. I would defend settlements only when they were distorted. I defended, listen, I remember when Israel annexed the Golan Heights, we were quiet. But when it was attacked, that this destroyed peace with Syria forever, I wound up defending Israel. Because it was a distortion, it was a lie, it was defamation, etc. And I think that's the role where the American Jewish community should come into. I don't think it should be American Jewish community's role to defend settlements. I think it should be Israel's role to defend settlements, except when it's distorted and put on a platform as anti-Semitic, as we just heard in this question.
Simone, I want to give you a chance to answer something you've talked about a lot, which is not necessarily feeling like we can call out hatred from radicalized Islam, because the majority of the Muslim community, and it needs to be said, are not in any way, they're not responsible for terrorism. They're not thinking about terrorism. It's a calumny. It's unfair. But you have said, and someone is asking about the reality of Muslim anti-Semitism, and particularly when these events happen, how do we address them and talk about them in the Jewish community?
Yeah. Listen, I think, in Europe, in Western Europe in particular, the issue of Muslim anti-Semitism is, of course, a big one. The reality, I mentioned the 13 French Jews who have been killed. They were killed by Muslims, radicalized Muslims, but they were killed by Muslims. So that's the reality. Unfortunately, we also have far-right attacks in Halle in Germany, but most of the attacks that happened, whether they were in Belgium, Denmark, in France, all happened from radicalized Muslims. So that's the reality. The big problem I think that we've had for a very long time was the difficulty of talking about it. Particularly in the beginning of the years of 2000, when anti-Semitism started to appear in Europe, there was people were shying away from it because they felt that they were sort of stigmatizing a community that itself was suffering from racism and discrimination, and they didn't want to amplify the problem. I think with that approach, we didn't render anyone any service, neither the Jewish community nor the society at large, and certainly not the Muslim community. I think it's only by addressing the issue head on, by looking the reality in the face, that we are actually able to deal with that. No one would say, of any other group that we've spoken. I've learned in school about Catholic anti-Semitism. It's never posed a problem. So I think we need to talk about it. I think we need to analyze it seriously. without stigmatizing the community at large, but looking at it very, very frankly. One of the things, for example, I mentioned early on, we've done surveys. We found, for example, that anti-Semitism in France and in Germany amongst Muslims increases when they're practicing, when they're more practicing, when they're going more to mosques. Now, we have to understand why that's the case. Is it because inherently there is a problem with Islam? I doubt that. I don't think that's the case. But maybe it's to do with the fact that what people are learning in those mosques. Maybe it has something to do with the fact that those mosques are being directed from Turkey, from Qatar, from foreign countries and getting money, where a version of Islam is being taught that is fundamentally fundamentalist and fundamentally anti-Semitic. So I think the only way of doing so is by trying to learn the facts, by trying to understand what exactly is going on.
I just want to make sure I understand that you're saying that that's been documented, that at the height of worship, there are more events?
Yes.
Jonathan, someone is asking about the influencers on social media, like the Hadid sisters, particularly during the May Gaza conflict in May 21. And recently, where Gigi Hadid equated the plight of Ukrainians and Palestinians. Do you think that this is contributing to the environment?
Well, I mean, there's no question that social media has an amplifying effect. There is absolutely none. And these influencers, I mean, they can have millions of followers, so their voices do matter. I mean, we have. It's very difficult to clamp down on speech like Gigi Hadid's because this, you might disagree with her sentiment, but it is not the kind of hate speech that violates the terms of service of a social media platform. But I just say that social media platforms create a terms of service. Those terms of service say you cannot attack other people based on religion, based on race, based on gender, based on sexual orientation. And despite what the former president says, these are private companies. They establish terms of services, and the terms of service need to be policed. So if an influencer violates the terms of service of that platform, that person has every right to be shut down and should be.
Abigail,
go ahead.
9/11, we struggled in this country to find a balance between liberty and freedom, and to find a balance. We have a major challenge to find a balance between freedom of speech. I'm talking about the U.S. because of our Constitution, and not so much Europe because they have other issues. But the United States, we need to find a balance between civility and freedom of speech. And the questions are very difficult. Do we trust government? Do we trust the individuals? We haven't figured it out. And until we do, the internet, social media has developed a superhighway for bigots and bigotry. And if you were to say to me or to us, what's the one factor in my lifetime that has changed anti-Semitism, my answer is the unintended consequences of this brilliant invention to education and interaction, the internet and social media. On one hand, what a blessing. But to us, to minorities, to truth, to civility, wow, what a disaster. And we need to come to grips with it. We need to come to figure out how to balance it. Otherwise, Jonathan, you're going to be, I wrote a book, Viral Hate, 10 years ago. We're going to be writing books from here on in, but the consequences are horrific.
Horrific, because if you can trace the views of the mass murderer in Norway to the views of the mass murderer in Halle, Germany, to the views of the mass murderer in New Zealand, to El Paso, to Pittsburgh, to Buffalo. It is not a coincidence that they are using the same language and posting the same manifestos. There is an international connection now of hate, and how to shut it down, I couldn't begin to tell you, but it is very, very scary.
So I would.
If I just one second, it's actually interesting for me to have that conversation because for years and years and years, Europeans pleaded with Americans to do something about this. Obviously, all of those companies are based in the United States. And for years and years, we were being told they're protected by the First Amendment. And so it's interesting to see that there is an evolution on your side of the Atlantic. I think we here in Europe, we have a different approach. We believe that it should not be left in the hands of private companies to regulate hate speech. We have very clear laws about how to regulate hate speech in the real world. And what Europeans are now trying to do is to apply what is illegal in the real world and put it in the virtual world. Again, it's the European approach, but I think at some point in the United States, you will have to find your own way of dealing with this because this is only going to get worse.
So now that we're thoroughly depressed and terrified, I would like to try to end on a note of optimism from each of you. So starting with Jonathan, if you could just give us a sense, and in your writing this book, was there anything that gave you hope in terms of combating anti-Semitism, in terms of a way through this?
Yeah, there's a young woman there. One of the progenitors of what I saw in 2016, 2017 online was something called Gamergate. Gamergate was actually an online organized attack on women designers of video games. It was misogyny, and there was actually some anti-Semitic element, but it was really misogyny. And the targets of Gamergate, these online these video game video game designers, have come up with these internet tools to fight back and to come up and to counsel how people can cover their tracks on to exist online without the kind of hatred that they have seen. And I think that in those women, there is some hope that there is at least some way to control this. And I will also just mention Twitter and Facebook are still cesspools to some extent, but the kind of absolute ugly anti-Semitism that I saw in 2016 and 2017, I'm not seeing anymore. So just a word of warning to Elon Musk. The efforts by these companies have had some successes, and the idea of pulling those back is really horrifying to me because they should be commended.
Simone.
As I mentioned earlier on, I think we have made progress. Once you have 73% of French people and Germans who believe that anti-Semitism is not the problem of Jews alone and who understand that it's a problem for society, they understand that anti-Semitism is intrinsically linked to the problems of our society. And I think that's a positive aspect. What I profoundly hope, 5 years ago, 6 years ago, I used to have conversations with my American friends and speak about the situation in Europe. And people would tell me, well, you should leave Europe. And I would say, are you so sure that that's not going to happen in the United States? And people would, smile at me or laugh at me. I really hope that what we have experienced in Europe serves as a cautionary tale for the United States, and that there are very concrete lessons to be learned. So for once, I hope that Europe can be helpful to the US rather than the other way around.
Thank you. And Abe, final word.
Yeah, also Simone, Jews have died in America because they are Jews in the last several years. So we've joined Europe in the last couple of years. Golda Meir once said Jews don't have the luxury to be pessimists. And personally, having survived the Shoah, I don't have the luxury to be a pessimist. I am an optimist. Many years ago, I went to a conference on whether or not Jewish civilization will survive the year 2050. And there was a study of history, the Spenglers, the Toynbees, to find out what's the essence. Why did the Roman civilization, the Greek civilization, the Incas, why did they perish? And why did the Jews survive? And if we can distill it, maybe that's the answer for the future. And what they found was that the difference to Jews and Jews vis-a-vis other civilizations is after the Roman Empire fell, the Romans said, "Feh, I don't want to be a Roman." The Greeks, after it defeated, they don't want to be. The secret of our survival, and that's the optimism, is that after every tragedy, the first expulsion, the second destruction of the temple, Jews, and after the Holocaust, when Jews woke up, brushed themselves off and said, "I want to be Jews. I want my children to be Jewish." When Soviet Jewry, after 50 years of persecution, woke up, they want to be Jews. That's what it's all about. So yeah, there will always be bigots. There will always be anti-Semites. But if we want to be Jews, we will find a ways not only to fight the hatred, but to build on our values, on our history, on that traditions that are precious, and to share them. So I continue to be optimistic.
Thank you. Thank you, Abe, Jonathan, Simone, for your time, for your attention, for your dedication to this issue. Thank you to the Streicker Center always for inviting me and all of us to gather on such an important topic. And a special shout out to Gadi Levy and to his whole team, including Erica and Ari and Warren, for your wonderful introduction. I hope we can continue talking. It's an important conversation, and that we all stay both vigilant and proud. Take care.